few days ago, I was cornered in the kitchen in my house by one of my most favorite people in this world. About 1 meter short, 5 years old, and she had a very serious look when my daughter approached me that day. So I knew this was going to be a very honest conversation. Daddy, why are you going away again? It's still that age when she's not very happy with me going away. I know this is going to change in a few years, but Daddy, why are you going away again? Well, I was invited. Where are you going? To Istanbul. What is Istanbul? It's a city. Where? In Turkey. What is Turkey? A country. What are you going to do there? Well, I'm going to a conference. What is a conference? That's a place where people come together and talk about something. So far, it's going well. But then she dropped the bomb. What are you going to be talking about? And I don't know if you've ever tried to explain human rights to a 5-year-old. I struggled. I think she got bored after a while, but then she got this very serious look at one point. And then she looked at me and she said, so, you're just going to be talking about how we all need to be nice to each other. Sometimes children are quite disarming, if you put it like that. So in case there was any doubt, this is what we were talking about today. Now you know. Thank you for inviting me. I might be a bit of an unusual guest, because I'm not a practitioner of human rights. I'm not educated in detail in human rights. I'm more the provocative part, maybe not as insightful as my two previous speakers, but I hope you will bear with me. When I prepared for this, I was really thinking about my experiences of more than 10 years being a frontline humanitarian worker, working in some of the conflicts that are still ongoing, that are again in the news now. I worked with disasters and emergency, conflict transformation, and many different topics. So I have come across human rights at one or the other point. And I thought about how am I going to go about this? And initially there was said there will be new words and new concepts introduced today. So I want to introduce you to one concept that I find very special. A yarn. I'm sorry to the translators for translating this. A yarn is an Aboriginal concept. The First Nation Australians, and I had the privilege to spend a lot of time with them and other indigenous communities around the world, they have a concept when they come together and converse that's called a yarn. The special thing about this is you share perspectives, and there is no right or wrong. There's no good or bad perspective. They're just perspectives, and all are equally worth. You share ideas, you share thoughts, you share reflections. And what happens is you listen to each other, and through that dialogue, you actually build a reality, a common reality. So my invitation to you today, and for the afternoon and the coming days, weeks, and months, approach this conversation as a yarn. The beauty is in a yarn, you don't try to convince each other about I'm right and you're wrong, or my perspective is the one we have to go about. It's about discovering insights that you haven't seen before. And now in the next few minutes, I'm going to give some of my reflections. The beauty in a yarn is you're looking at the past, the future, and the present. And the spheres are mixing. And I think that's very important when we talk about a topic like human rights, which was valuable in the past and will be very valuable in the future, and certainly, as we heard from my previous two speakers, is valuable now. What you also do in a yarn is you explore something very specific, one of my favorite topics, mental models. Now, mental models are nothing else than fundamental assumptions that we have about how the world works. Some of them we know about, we're very vocal about. That could be our values, for example. Some of them we don't know about. We only find out once we're confronted by someone who has a different mental model from ours. And mental model could be anything as simple as, do I take the shoes off when I come into a house or not? All the way up to how we communicate, what decisions we make, forecasts for the future, planning. And everything contains these mental models. So when I prepared for this, I went to what are my mental models that I have encountered in my work with human rights, that I maybe have carried myself, and that might be worth yarning about. And I chose 3 mental models, which I find are very foundational to the whole idea of the human rights agenda, and which I think are worth taking a look at when we talk about how to reshape it, renew it, transform it, foster it. And the first mental model is that human rights are universal. The first thing that comes to mind when I hear this, that's a bold statement. And I wonder who makes that statement. I also even more wonder, what does it mean if something is universal? Does that mean the framework gives space to all the different traditions we have around the world? The diverse way of looking at things? Does that framework give space to different views on concept it contains? Is a life worth the same everywhere in the world? Is freedom looked upon the same everywhere in the world? And you can already hear there will be a lot of questions in my short talk, because I'm not claiming I have the answer. I'm not claiming anything, actually. I'm just sharing my perspective and invite you to share yours afterwards. So when we go back to universal, I had to think about the conversations that I've had with indigenous leaders, who always smile a little bit when we talk about concepts that are 75 years old, 76 this year. It's very young in their thinking. It's a concept that still grows. But what they also say is that universal in their world is often the balance of everything, the connection of everything. And all of these indigenous peoples, almost all of them, have an idea of duality and interconnectedness. That means, simplified, one concept needs a counter-concept for it to give it meaning. Leadership needs followership for it to have meaning. If we had no followers, what would leadership be? Good needs bad to give it meaning. And we have to move between those two spheres in order to keep the balance. Because if we focus on one thing too much, there's an universal imbalance. So looking at human rights, and when I thought about this, there are for me 2 things that stick out where I personally perceive an imbalance. The first thing is the normative character of the framework and the agenda. We have the urge, in modern times it gets even stronger, to define everything, to find the right word, the right phrase that captures everything. What we do by that is we create a little bit our own enemies. Now, I worked with crisis for a long time. Crisis is one of these terms that everybody thinks, I understand it. But if I asked you just simply the question, what's the opposite of a crisis, I would get a lot of different answers. And that happens when we try to define something. In the indigenous belief, we're creating a boundary. We're actually creating a box. What about the descriptive element of it? How does it feel if a right is upheld? What are our responsibilities? What are the actions it needs to do to implement this right? How can we make something that's very normative more descriptive to keep the balance? I think that's worth looking at. A second thing that sticks out is that even though we're talking about all of us, at the core of it, it seems like focusing rather on an individual aspect. The rights of the individual. Sure, there's frameworks that focus also on collective rights, but when you look at it at the core, the explicit part seems to be rather individual. Now, how about the translation to making that collective? How do we as a collective benefit from it? Where's the interconnectedness in the human rights? And how can we make that more explicit? Because at the end of the day, we need to address both here. The individual is only as much worth as the collective. And if we're not making this more explicit, we might lose one of the spheres and create an imbalance. So looking back to that first fundamental assumption, the mental model that we have, that human rights are universal. I encourage you to share your views on it, your reflections, what it means if something's universal, how we can make that claim, and how we can make sure that we keep a balance and not move into one or the other spheres. The second mental model I want to explore is that it's about equality and equal for all people. When I was a student and I studied a very exciting subject, political science, it's very dry. So when I was looking for a final paper, a topic, I didn't really find anything. As it happened, an NGO was reaching out to the university where I was studying at the time and needed to do someone to do a situational analysis of the Pygmy people. That's an indigenous people, specifically a tribe that lived in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Ituri region, in the rainforest there. They live very basic, hunter-gatherers, no electricity, old ways. Now that is, of course, for political science not enough. You need theory. So after a lot of back and forth, my thesis was about how to protect minority rights without a universally accepted definition of minority, and the case study was the Pygmies in Eastern Congo. It was almost like writing two different papers. One was very technical. So I put myself into the history of the term minority. I put myself into the legal frameworks as much as I could with my limitations. I put it against the constitution of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which at the time was considered quite progressive. And then I moved to the case study, to reality. And the Pygmies had no protection. They weren't even considered people. They were considered subhumans, closer to monkeys, because of the way they lived, because of their physical appearance, because they're generally rather short. They were exposed to unspeakable human rights violations. They were facing discrimination on all levels. But they were denied citizenship, so there were a lot of legal issues around it. But what I was confronted with for the first time, and I should see that many times afterwards, is something you all know. It's a gap, a huge gap between the idea and the agenda of human rights and how they look in reality for people. And that gap can be translated into different topics. So one naturally is a power gap. Declaration of human rights comes from a position of power. Upholding it, as we've heard before, is also very much dependent on power still. So there's a dependency gap. Then we have a knowledge gap. Not only do many people not know about their human rights, those who know about it sometimes don't understand it. I remember having worked with organizations that had beautiful paragraphs in their project proposals about how they were going to protect women's rights and gender equality. And when I came to visit, a staff member showed up, visibly having been exposed to domestic violence, and her colleagues had nothing better to do than to say, well, she probably deserved it. Male and female colleagues. And how does that match with the project proposal? So there is a translation, a knowledge gap. The third one, and we heard a lot about the context, and there's definitely gaps that are imposed by the context. We can't do much about them. But there's also homemade gaps. Human rights and the legal agenda is tribal language. Now me, partly educated in it, I still struggle following conversations of experts like you are, sometimes when you get very technical. There's a huge gap, sometimes what it means. And I have several times experienced this as very frustrating in terms that we got stuck on a definition of terms, of laws, of legal aspects of it, instead of looking at the operational aspect. Now Syria is in the news, and I mentioned before to some, this is almost like closing a cycle for me. I used to work in Syria at the beginning of the war. I was there helping to prepare for how to keep the humanitarian operations running with the increasing escalation of the conflict. We were trying to alert high-level decision makers in the agencies that I worked for about the urgency to do something. what it ended up being that meeting, and I was just an observer, so one of the most frustrating things in my whole life, was a 1-hour discussion. What is it actually that's happening? Is it a civil war? Is it internal unrest? Is it conflict with international dimensions? It became a legal exercise. While we were trying to operationalize everything. And at the end, it was adjourned by saying, like, we meet again in 6 weeks, and then we see whether we can define it now. And that creates a gap between the people who want to work with it, like many of you, or all of you probably, and the people who really are interested in formulating and developing them. So it's worth, what I'm curious about is your experiences with this. There's so much wealth and knowledge here. So yarning about this and sharing how you experience this, what you actually do about this to close this gap, because I think all of you are working with precisely that. But sharing these experiences is crucial, because maybe together we can create that reality where we find new ways and ideas of doing it in our individual positions. And the final mental model is probably the hardest one and the most uncomfortable one for all of us. The final mental model is that human rights are about doing good. As a humanitarian, when I started my career, I was very idealistic. All I wanted to do is make the world a better place, like all as we're sitting here. And very early in my career, I was tasked on a project where I had to look at previous projects and program of my then employer for the harm that they had done. This was very sobering. I didn't expect to find much. I mean, after all, we're there to do good. I found a lot of things that we've done that were harmful, many of them unintended. Some of them were simply trade-offs. So now the question for the yarn, and I think it's an uncomfortable, but it's an important one. What harm and unintended consequences does the human rights agenda come with? And the first thing that comes to mind, and we heard about it already before, is the whole idea of freedom of speech. So we live now in what I like to call the world of the after-truth. There is no objectively verifiable truth anymore, it seems. Because information is so easily accessible for everybody at any time that it has never been easier before in history to manipulate it and create and use it for your own agenda. All under the banner of freedom of speech. So are there dilemmas inherent in the human rights agenda that we should look at, openly address and talk about, how we can prepare ourselves for? Is maybe the human rights agenda an agenda that, without wanting it, reinforces power dynamics? Does it give more power to the people that already have power? We heard before from both speakers that it's important to take the power away from those, but have we systemically given them already more? It's a question to also potentially look at. And finally, on that mental model, I got really furious during the pandemic when I live in Norway, and I've learned a lot about Norwegians. I'm not Norwegian myself. And in the 12 years that I've lived there, I've learned a lot. And one of the things is that they like to go to cabins. They like to spend their time in nature. That could be public cabins, very rudimentary cabins without electricity or water, or a bit fancier versions of that. But the thing is, it's a part of the culture. And especially during Easter, they vacate the cities and go to the countryside. Now, during the pandemic, there was a cabin ban because the government didn't want to overburden the health systems in these remote locations if people were to get sick. So people weren't allowed to go to their cabins. One day I opened the news and the headline is that the human rights expert in Norway said that the cabin ban is a breach of human rights. Now you have immediately turned a global important agenda into a first world problem by simply saying that. And I'm not a scholar, so I don't know if that's true or not. But the point is, it undermines something so important by the way it's used. And again, an unintended consequence. Not that this person wanted it, but it was of course picked up and used in rhetoric, in argumentation, and other things. So I think it's important to take that discussion. Is there unintended harm embedded in it? And my encouragement to you, and with that I want to close, is that don't get stuck on a too easy sentence that I have heard so many times when the conversations became difficult, is like, it's the best alternative we have. We won't find out if there's a better or other alternative unless we try, explore, build a reality, and yarn about it. And there's no better way to do this with so many brilliant minds in the room. 4 Arrows, a chief of a First Nation American tribe, once said that the capability of losing humanity seems to be a unique trait to the human space. Other species, they also turn insane and lose themselves when they are caged or lose their natural habitat. But it seems that the human race is the only one that does it deliberately. So with that in mind, we need human rights. We need this agenda desperately. But it shouldn't stop us from yarning about what we can do differently, renew it, find new ways, and settle. So that we, at the end of the day, know how we all can be nice to each other. Thank you very much.